Good evening, everybody. I am so delighted to welcome all of you to this year's Martin Luther King Lecture. And this event actually marks the 20th lecture in a series established in 1996 to honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Now, before I begin, I want to extend my gratitude to the organizers of this event, mainly Vice President for Institutional Equity and Diversity, Shante Delalue, and the staff. We can applaud twice, and the staff in the Office of Institutional Equity and Diversity for organizing this work. Thank you. Now, today, I am just thrilled that we have with us Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. She is President Emerita of Spelman College and an acclaimed author and academic. She's a widely recognized leader in higher education and race relations, and she will share insights in a moderated discussion this evening. So a little bit about her background before we start. For 13 years, Dr. Tatum served as president of Spelman College, the oldest historically Black liberal arts college for women in America, where her leadership was marked by excellence and growth and innovation. During her tenure, she oversaw significant campus improvements, completed the largest fundraising campaign in the history of the institution, and she launched something called the Wellness Revolution, which was and is a holistic initiative designed to empower and educate Spelman women and the communities they'll influence on key components of lifelong wellness. Dr. Tatum also led efforts to increase opportunities for international travel for students and faculty and provide additional financial aid for international students. And her visionary leadership was recognized in 2013 with the Carnegie Academic Leadership Award. An author, educator, psychologist, she has spent decades seeking to understand racial identity development, especially among Black families and children in majority white neighborhoods. Dr. Tatum is the author of multiple books, and I'm sure many of you have read at least some of these. They include Can We Talk About Race and Other Conversations in an Era of School Resegregation, and the revered Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race, which was selected by the National Association of Multicultural Education as its top book of 1998. She's unique in that her books are often recommended for academics and administrators alike. Over the course of her decades-long career, she's received numerous awards, and I'm probably going to miss some of them, but they include the American Psychological Association's prestigious Award for Outstanding Lifetime Contribution to Psychology. This is the association's highest honor, and the Brock International Prize in Education. So we are really grateful. I'm very grateful personally that the Martin Luther King Jr. Lecture brings renowned individuals like Dr. Tatum to College Hill. In today's conversation, moderated by Vice President Delalue, she'll offer insights on race and education informed by her decades of leadership in the academy. They'll also discuss critical issues such as the role of racial identity in educational settings, the importance of cross-racial dialogue, and the role of institutions of higher education in addressing issues of equity and diversity, which are things near and dear to all of our hearts. So with that, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Tatum and Vice President Delalue to the stage. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
What a pleasure it is to be here this evening. Thank you, and it's an honor, a complete honor. We're going to get right started. Just so everyone knows, this evening I will engage in a conversation with Dr. Tatum, and there will be an opportunity for questions and answers from the audience at the end. So, as this is our MLK Lecture, I'd like to frame the start of our conversation with Dr. King's 1967 book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? In it, he discusses a number of key factors that he believed needed to be the focus of the United States in the future. That included poverty, racism, political voice, and quality of education. 50 years later, in 2017, you released the 20th anniversary edition of your seminal text, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, and Other Conversations on Race. In the prologue, you covered racism, political environments, and school segregation. Can you start by just telling us how Dr. King's writings and your scholarly work are issues that still plague us in the U.S. today?
Sure. Well, let me begin by saying I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank President Paxson for her warm welcome and for you for agreeing to be my conversation partner this evening, and all of you for coming. And I'm really glad we're starting with that quote from Dr. King's last book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? Because even though his book is 50 years old now, more than that, when I read it back in 2017 on the 50th anniversary, actually 2018, 50th anniversary marking the 50th year after his assassination, I was struck by how prescient the book was in terms of describing our contemporary moment. One of the things he talks about in that book is that after every period of racial progress or period of social progress more broadly, you can see historically that there's been a period of pushback against that progress. So that, as he says, the line of progress is never straight. There's always this, 2 steps forward, 1 step back process. And certainly, if we understand our current moment, I think you can see the pushback against previous progress, whether that's pushback against voting rights, pushback against affirmative action, pushback against a variety, women's right to choose, pushback against many positive or progressive social movements. And one of the things that Dr. King says in his book, as he reflects on that, one of the things he says is that, you can change laws, but at the end of the day, what really matters in terms of changing people's behavior and attitudes is empathic understanding of somebody else's experience. And I think one of the things I have tried to communicate in my book is that in order to get to that empathic understanding, we have to be willing to engage in dialogue with one another in ways that hopefully move us beyond polarization to positive action. So we can move forward again.
Yeah, thank you. We'll stay on that book for a little bit, and I'll juxtapose 2 quotes, one from his book and one from your book.
Okay.
He said, the United States is far from providing each child with as much education as he can use. Our school system still primarily functions as a system of exclusion. You said, our public schools are more segregated today than they were in 1980, as measured by the percentage of all Black students who are attending schools that are 90 to 100% non-white, with the highest rates of school segregation in the Northeast. So as someone who grew up watching Dr. King on TV, real time, to the present in your work in racial and education and racial identity development, how do you see those 2 quotes being similar, different, and how is it affecting education today?
I think they are describing the same thing, which is systemic inequity in our system of public education. So many people are surprised to hear, we mark every year the passing of Brown versus Board of Education, which goes back to, May 1954. So in 2019, we were 65 years past that decision. And many people are surprised to learn that our schools are almost desegregated today as they were then, back in 54, for different reasons, not legally mandated, but the pushback against the desegregation that occurred in the 60s and 70s, mandated by the Department of Education, has essentially been reversed by a series of Supreme Court decisions that chipped away at the requirements of Brown. Those Supreme Court decisions made possible by 4 appointees, Supreme Court appointees made by Richard Nixon, And one of his criteria in appointing judges was appointing people who were not sympathetic or perhaps even opposed to school busing. So if we look at cases across the, from 1970 through 2010, you will see a series of decisions that have made it difficult for districts to put policies in place, whether that's magnet schools. You can't really have an effective magnet school program unless you can take race into consideration. Supreme Court ruled that you can't do that, K through 12. You can't have cross-district busing. There are a variety of barriers, legal barriers that have eliminated the strategies that are available to folks. Without getting too much in the weeds about that, what we can say for sure is that hyper-segregated schools that have very few white students in them, majority black and brown schools, are predictably under-resourced. They tend to have less experienced teachers. They tend to have less well-resourced facilities. They tend to just not be providing the same quality, less rigorous curriculum. They don't provide the same quality of education that can be found in majority white institutions. So we know that while the magic is not necessarily in who's sitting next to who, but the magic is about resources. Mm-hmm. And the parents of the brown children who were at the heart of that first case were seeking access to resources. And that is still the problem in many districts today.
So you've touched on a few things already, and we've just done 2 questions.
I'm just getting started.
Yeah, the way in which policy impacts education.
Yeah.
How schools that have high levels of non-white students are under-resourced, but the need for empathetic engagement, mm-hmm. right? So if we take those 3 things, how can we engage in, what does empathetic engagement look like as it pertains to the political environment?
Well, I think what you just embedded in your question is, I think, the challenge of, how can people meaningfully engage with each other if they're not in the same spaces? That is a challenge, and of course we can talk about the role that technology can play and, strategies that can happen to expand engagement with people different from oneself. But it's one of the reasons why I talk about the importance, if we move beyond K through 12, the importance of higher ed environments. Because public and private higher education institutions tend to be more diverse than the K through 12 systems are. So for many students coming to a school like Brown or any number of other institutions, they are entering into a learning environment that's more diverse than the one they left. And for a lot of students, it may be the most diverse environment that they have experienced in their lives to date. Because, to just say another word about school segregation, in today's world, in the United States, most students are attending schools in their geographic parameters, right, in their neighborhoods. And residential segregation persists in the United States. So if you're in a residentially segregated community, you're going to be going to a school that's segregated, unless there's some voluntary busing program like METCO in the Boston area or something like that. And even so, even in those cases, the percentage of students who are being bused in is relatively small. So having said that, knowing that students are coming out of segregated environments, typically residential or school, then they come to a more diverse learning environment. The question for educators at the post-secondary level is, how are we using that diversity to create those learning opportunities? One of the things I talk about in my book certainly are the places that are using structured programs like intergroup dialogue, for example, curricular interventions, to create those learning opportunities in the classroom, which is in some ways the best place because it's the most structured place to try to do that. But not enough institutions are taking that initiative.
Yeah.
It's a missed opportunity if we don't.
Right. So I have two follow-up questions to that. One, and I'll start with, in your work, you have examined Black children in predominantly white settings, right? What did your research say about outcomes for those children? I mean, so they are not in a segregated, but they're sometimes the only one or the only family and those types of things. And so what does your research say about that?
Sure. So that's not, I talk a little bit about that and why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria, but that really goes back to my first book, which is called Assimilation Blues, Black Families and White Communities. And my interest in that topic has everything to do with the fact that I grew up in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, right? So when I was a kid, I was the only Black kid in my class. And grew up in a town that had a very small Black population. And when I got to college, and then later in graduate school, I was interested in understanding how other families had experienced that particular situation. And in particular, I was interested in what parents did to shape or help shape their children's sense of racial identity. So I interviewed Black families, parents, living in predominantly white communities, and talked to them about how they created a sense of community for their children. How important was it, for example, to them that their children had Black friends? What kinds of lessons or messages did they share in terms of talking about family, racial history, and how important identity issues were? These were the general nature of my questions. And what I learned was that not every family does it the same way, and that there were patterns that you could recognize. Some families were what I called race conscious. They said, it's important to us that our children have a strong sense of racial identity, and we know that it's not going to be a natural outcome of living in this predominantly white community. So we have to do some things intentionally. We have to find a community of Black kids that they can be a part of. Maybe that means we're going to join an organization like Jack and Jill. Maybe that means I'm going to take my kids with me when I go to those conventions of Black professionals. Maybe that means I'm going to send my kid back home to Georgia, even though I now live in, Massachusetts. Maybe for the summer so that they can be part of another community. Maybe that means we're going to drive outside of where we live right now to another town so they can attend a majority Black congregation and worship with other Black people on Sundays. That we're going to be very intentional in creating these experiences. That's what race conscious means in that context. Then there were families that said, I wish our children had those experiences. They're important to me, but I haven't figured out how to get it done. They were sort of more laissez-faire about it, and I call those families race neutral. And then there were families that said, it's really not that important. In fact, maybe I'm living here because I don't really want to associate in that way. And I called those families race avoidant. So then the natural question was, what difference does it make if you are a race avoidant family or a race neutral family or a race conscious family in terms of how your children later come to think of themselves? And so in order to answer that question, I interviewed college students Black college students who had grown up in predominantly white communities and asked them questions about their parents' strategies, what they had experienced at home and how that and what the nature of their transition to college had been like and how they were coping in that college environment. And what I found was that all of the kids that I interviewed, all the college students that I talked to, had race-related challenges. Today we call them microaggressions. At the time that I was working on this, we weren't using that language. But things where name calling, racial incidents, just general harassment or feeling left out, not being invited, not being included, having the professor say, no, I'm sorry, I can't help you today, and perceiving that as a different response than the white student who was in his office moments before, that kind of stuff. And what I found was that those students who had grown up in race-conscious families appeared to be more resilient in the face of those kinds of experiences because they were able to name racism as a problem that someone else was having, as opposed to, this is not about me, this is about you, right? And if you can say that, you don't internalize it in the same way. But the race-neutral, kids who grew up in race-neutral families, sometimes they could do that, sometimes they couldn't. But the ones most at risk were the race-avoidant families. Because in the race-avoidant families, those families had actively avoided talking about race-related issues. You know, those topics were toxic in those families, and they didn't want to talk about them or didn't talk about them. And the young people growing up in those families had learned that they weren't supposed to talk about it either, which meant that when they encountered those kinds of experiences, it was difficult for them to reach out for support, and they had difficulty framing it as someone else's problem, and more likely to internalize it as there's something wrong with me. And of course, that leads to feelings of depression and isolation and all of that. So it's a long-winded answer to your question, but the short version is there are different strategies and some work better than others, and when parents ask me what should they be, I tell them race-conscious works best.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you. You know, in talking about your early work,
Yeah.
what theoretical framing and underpinnings did you use? Did it change over time? And specifically, in Why Are the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, you speak about using racial identity development.
Yeah. So I want to say, you know, that I went to Wesleyan University as an undergrad, and I had the wonderful experience of studying with a black woman who was a psychologist, my first ever black professor, black female professor at Wesleyan, and she introduced me to some work by William Cross, who is a psychologist and writes a lot about racial identity development theory. That's when I was first exposed. He wrote an article in the 70s, and I am dating myself now, but that's when I was in college. So, so he wrote this article about what he called the theory of psychological negrescence, or becoming black, you know, sort of claiming a black identity. I was very impressed with that. And then I go off to graduate school, University of Michigan, and I'm studying you know, as a clinical psychologist. That's, you know, my goal. But continuing to read about racial identity, and then I discovered the work of Janet Helms, who wrote not only about black racial identity development, but white racial identity development. A lot of this work was in the counseling psychology literature. And then, fast forward, I had the opportunity to teach a course on the psychology of racism, the first time ever teaching it in 1980. In fact, that wasn't the title of the course at the time. So just to put this in context, I am in 1980 what we call ABD, right? All but dissertation. The academics will know that means all but dissertation. So I am almost finished with my Ph.D., but not quite. I got married in Michigan, and my husband and I moved to UC Santa Barbara, California, because he had an opportunity there, and I was, as they say, the trailing spouse. So I'm there, and I have a dissertation to write. Now, as it happens, my dissertation was on the experiences of black families in predominantly white communities. So Santa Barbara was not a bad place to be from that point of view. But so I'm working on my dissertation, but I decide I need a job, and I got a part-time job working as a therapist in the campus counseling center at UC Santa Barbara. So that's what I'm doing. But while I'm doing that, someone approached me about teaching a class on education and the black child in the Black Studies department. So I did. As an adjunct, I taught that class. Went pretty well. And then someone asked me, the chair of the department said, you know, that class went well, would you like to teach something else? I'm like, sure, what have you got? And he said, well, there's this class nobody else wants to teach. It's called Group Exploration of Racism. So this course was designed by a faculty member who was no longer there. But when that person was there, it had become a requirement for students majoring in Black Studies. And so it was a problem that they weren't offering it, right? Because it's a requirement. But none of the other faculty members in the department wanted to teach it. And I think the main reason is because it was called Group Exploration of Racism. Right. And it was designed to be a very interactive, sort of group facilitated, discussion-based course. It wasn't a lecture-based course. And I had never taught a course like that. But as a clinician, I knew how to facilitate groups. So when the chair asked me if I wanted to teach this class, I thought to myself, how hard could this be? Right? Which just speaks to the fact that I was 26 years old and didn't know better. And so I started teaching this class. So I said, yes, I'll do it. And I, dug up some resources and started preparing the syllabus. And I found a very useful set of materials that the person had left behind. And anyway, taught the course for the first time. And it was okay. It went pretty well. It was challenging, no doubt. But at the end of the semester, my students wrote on their evaluations things like, this course has changed my life. Wow. Why is it that I had to wait till I was a senior in college to have these conversations? Everyone at the university should be required to take this course. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that people said. And so I was like, wow, this is really important. And so I was asked to teach it again, and I did it again and again and again. We only lived in Santa Barbara 4 years, but I probably taught the course 8 or 9 times. Wow. During that time period, because they were on a trimester system. So 3 times a year I was doing it. And it really became clear to me that there was a need for something like this in the curriculum. So I decided that I was not going to be a therapist, or at least not full-time, that I would prefer to be a professor. And I started applying for teaching positions. So my first tenure-track position was here in New England, in Massachusetts. And when I interviewed, they were looking for somebody to teach theories of personality, which of course I knew how to do. But when the chair of the department said, well, everybody gets to choose a course of their own making, or their own particular interest. And so, after you've taught theories of personality and child development and that stuff, what would you like to teach? And I said, well, I'd like to teach a course on the psychology of racism. How about that? And he said, if you want to. And so that's what I did. And so I got that job and I taught that course, and it really became kind of a signature. But here's the thing as it relates to racial identity development theory. I noticed back in California when I was teaching that class that there were certain behaviors, particularly among the white students, that were predictable in terms of their response to the material. There was at first some initial interest, and then there was guilt. And then there was, I don't want to talk about this anymore. And then there was, that there was a pattern. But if you sort of could get people past the I don't want to talk about it anymore phase, usually happened in the middle of the semester, you could move them to a different place where they really started to actively explore what does it mean to be a white person in a race-conscious society, and did that with some enthusiasm. And that was not unlike the stages that Janet Helms had described. And so then I was very interested in kind of mapping the pattern of student response. And keep in mind, in Santa Barbara, almost all the students were white at that time. Mapping their response to the content and how one could use your understanding of racial identity development theory to structure a course that facilitated their deeper learning. And that was a set of observations I made in California. Fast forward, now I'm teaching at Westfield State College, now known as Westfield State University, also a majority white institution, this course on the psychology of racism, and I'm noticing the same pattern. And I'm also noticing among the black students I'm encountering a pattern of development that maps to what William Cross had written about. But when I was a professor at Westfield State, I had a very heavy teaching load. I was teaching 3 courses a semester and also doing 10 hours of counseling in the counseling center. And that was 3 different preparations plus counseling is a lot from a professor's point of view. And so I decided I needed a different job. And I got a different job, and that was at Mount Holyoke College, where I went to Mount Holyoke and was only teaching 2 courses a semester. Period.
Right.
And so I felt like I was on vacation, and I had an opportunity to do more writing.
Yeah.
So I wrote an article about these observations I'd made using data from student journals that I started to collect, and it was called Talking About Race, Learning About Racism, the Application of Racial Identity Development Theory in the Classroom. And when I wrote that article, my colleague at Mount Holyoke suggested that I send it to a small publication known as the Harvard Ed Review. I'm a psychologist, right? I, as a psychologist, did not read the Harvard Educational Review. And so it didn't occur, I wasn't aware that having my article published as a lead article in the Harvard Ed Review would be significant. It turned out it was. But anyway, that's what happened. So the article got, and what happened, which was really exciting retrospectively, I didn't anticipate this, but you know, and all this has to do with being a junior person, becoming a senior person, but the article appeared in the 1992 edition, spring 92 edition of Harvard Ed Review, and I am having my first ever sabbatical in the spring that year, and my husband, who was also a professor, now is teaching in his line of work. He's working in education, and he goes to the American Educational Research Association. I'm a psychologist. I don't go to AERA. I go to APA, right? So this is about silos and disciplinary separation. But I'm on sabbatical. He's going to AERA. I decide to go with him. And I'm sitting in the back of the room, and a famous educational researcher named James Banks is giving a lecture. And in the middle of his lecture, he starts talking about this article he's read in the Harvard Educational Review. And I'm sitting next to a guy who has a folder on his lap, and you know, a little tab on the folder, and it says Tatum article. And the article has just come out, and what was really striking to me was that the article in some ways was a translation of psychological theory in the world of counseling psychology into a world of educational researchers, and they didn't know about identity development theory. And so it was a real aha moment for me that there was this opportunity to kind of bridge fields and talk about ideas that educators needed to know, but that they weren't regularly being exposed to. It was a kind of a turning point in my career.
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna ask a question about a course I teach, because a lot of what you spoke about is your research, but really the things that you were able to call from the classroom.
Yes.
That then continue to propel your work. So I teach a course, African Atlantic Diaspora, Race, Memory, Identity, and Belonging. And it's during our winter session, we take students, we have an intense week on campus and then 2 weeks in Ghana. And the makeup of this last course is a course where students have to apply, was primarily Black identified students. And several of whom would identify as being U.S. descendants of enslaved Africans. The second core group was Black international students who were here on a visa. And the third group were first generation immigrant students. So their families have migrated from the continent here. And you know, this understanding of what is Black, who is Black, and who gets to decide was a core part of our conversations. And so how does your work think about the complexities of Blackness? Yeah.
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think one of the things that I talk about in Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together, in that version of my book, is the fact that the questions of identity are core to adolescent development. Right? I mean, that's what adolescents are doing. And by adolescents, I'm not just talking about high school students, right? You know, young adults, that we are all at that stage of our lives asking questions about who am I? How do other people, and let me just say this about that question, who am I? However you answer that question, I sometimes do this exercise where I ask people to fill in the sentence, I am fill in the blank, in as many different ways as you can in 60 seconds. And if you give people that task and ask them to write down, the words that come to mind in that first 60 seconds, and they read their lists, everybody's list is going to be different, but there are some patterns that you will observe, right? Some people will make reference to race or ethnicity. Some people won't mention it. Some people will make reference to gender. Some people won't mention it. Some people will make reference to religion. Some people won't mention it. Some people will make reference to sexual orientation. Some people won't mention it. Some people might make reference to language. Some people won't mention it. And so if you look at who mentions what, it tends to follow patterns of those identities in which we have felt marginalized or in some way targeted, right? So if I am aware that people are paying attention to my racial group membership, I'm likely to include Black or African American in my list of descriptors. But if I've grown up as a white person in an entirely white community where we have not spent time talking about whiteness, I might, as one of my students say, I'm just normal, right? I might not be thinking about myself in those terms. When I worked in co-ed environments, it was very common for the students in my psychology class, the women students, to mention being female, but often the male students didn't mention being male on their list. You get the pattern. So all of this is to say, how we think about who we are is not just in our own heads. It has to do with our interactions with other people and the feedback that we are getting. If you write down, I am smart, well, why do you think so? Because somebody said it about you, right? Over the course of your life, you got that feedback. If you write down, I am pretty, it's because someone said that about you, right? You didn't just, maybe you looked in a mirror and said, oh, but it's likely that it's because someone gave you feedback, from childhood on, right? So that feedback shapes how we define things. Now, how we define things are also shaped by our lived experience. So I told you already, I grew up in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. And when I first got to Wesleyan University, I made friends with a Black woman who'd grown up in the South Bronx. And one of the things she told me after we became friends was that she was suspicious of me when she first met me because I smiled too much, right? And why was I so happy?
Yes.
Well, maybe because, I hadn't had to struggle in the same ways that she had struggled, right? I didn't grow up in a low-income family. My parents were both educators. My father we were living in Bridgewater because my father was teaching at Bridgewater State, right? So there were, my life experience was very different from hers, and yet my experience in Bridgewater was a uniquely Black experience. I can guarantee that it was different than the white students in my class, right? But it was not the same as her Black experience in the South Bronx. There's obviously multiple kinds of experiences, but when we're adolescents, we tend to think about our own experience as the experience, right? And that has everything to do with the egocentrism of young adulthood, right? I'm not trying to cast shade on anybody, I'm just saying that is the nature of it, right? That's the nature of it. So you think your experience is everybody else's experience, but it's not, right? So when you are having your trip and you've got, perhaps not exclusively, but a lot of young adults, part of what they're confronting is their experience, the lens through which they look, is not the same as the people next to them who might look like them, but whose life experience is very different.
Do you think the existing theoretical framing around racial identity development, whether it's Helms or Cross, your work, expands beyond U.S. experiences?
I think it can. Now I think it's with caution, right? Because I think when I say it can, I think it's hard for me to imagine, and this may be my own Western-centric brain, but it's hard to imagine an environment where identity doesn't matter,
True.
right? I mean, it's hard to identify a social environment where you don't get feedback, even if your feedback is you're not to stand out, right? I mean, some people will say, you're encouraged to conform and not stand out, and individualistic versus collective. We can talk about that variation, but even in that continuum, there's still some acknowledgement of oneself as an entity, even if it's part of a larger collective, right? And so how we think about ourselves is shaped by our environment. We get the cues of how we're supposed to think about ourselves from our environment. So would the process of coming to understand oneself be the same in a Black majority environment than in a Black minority environment? Probably not. Right. But at the same time, I think we have to also look at the impact of colonialism across the globe. And there are ways in which white supremacist ideology has been internalized, even in places where the people are not majority white. Colorism is an example, and you can find examples of that not just in African descended communities, but in Asian communities and
Yes.
Lots of places.
Yeah, and speaking of that, so in this version, the 20th anniversary edition, you do make a point to talk beyond the Black-white binary.
Yeah, I did that in the first one, but I did it more in the second one.
More.
Yeah.
Can you speak a bit of why you expanded upon speaking about that?
Sure. Well, partly it has very practically to do with population change.
Yeah.
Right? So if you look at the way our population has changed pretty dramatically, even in the last 20 years, if you are born today in 2020, you are part of a cohort of babies that is only about 50% white. If you were born in 1954, as I was, you were part of a cohort of babies that was 90% white. Right? In 1954, the US population was 90% white, 10% everybody else, which is quite striking if you think about how diverse our population is today. Some of that has to do with differential birth rates, but a lot of it has to do with immigration. And I think that in 1965, as this audience may know, but in case they don't, I will say, in 1965, legislation passed that opened the doors of immigration beyond Europe to Africa, South America, South Asia, So the growth in the Asian American population goes back to 1965, rapid increase in African immigrants, all of that happening post-1965. People may not know, but it wasn't until I want to say 1958, I might be wrong about the date, but in the 50s, that you could become a citizen if you were white. If you were not white. So if you immigrated here, doesn't matter how long you lived here, you couldn't become a citizen unless you were white. That didn't change until like 1957, 1958. So there were a lot of Asians, for example, who came to work on the railroads, who stayed, whose families stayed, but who never were allowed to be citizens. Their children could be citizens if they were born here, but the adults could not become citizens until that law passed in the 50s. So this is to say, with the increasing diversity of the population, it seemed important to me to expand on the experiences of racism and how that identity development process was playing itself out for the Latinx population, Asian American population, Middle Eastern, North Africans, it's Native indigenous people. And as I said, there was some of that in Why Are All the first version of Why Are All the Black Kids, but I really wanted to expand it, both because the populations have expanded, but also because the information had expanded.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
More research.
We're going to move to audience questions and answers. I could probably sit here all night and talk to Dr. Tatum, but we'll certainly give you all an opportunity to ask questions. I want to continue on that thought with the census and how the census changed, where as of 2000, the question around racial identity is, are you Hispanic? Yes or no?
You could change.
And
you could choose more than one thing.
Yes, and you can choose more than one thing. And then what is your race? And what they saw was a lot of Latinx, Hispanic identified individuals skip the race question because they're like, that is my race. And over time, more have chosen white, even if you look at in higher ed, right? So by law, if you receive federal funding, you have to submit your common data set, and we ask those same questions. What we see when we look deeper, and when that change happened, was that students were confused about that. Students who identified as Latinx, Hispanic, all of a sudden being asked, what is your race? Right? So again, how does that play in the changes? Ami and Winnett talked about how racial identity shifts in the U.S. It's manipulated, changed, abandoned, transformed. So can you speak to that?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's complicated, right? As I talk about in the book, it is complicated, and not everywhere defines race in the same way that it's defined in the United States. I mean, even if we just think about the United States and its history of the one-drop rule, right? So historically, if you had one drop, meaning, even a small percentage of African ancestry, you were classified as Black. And that was whether you looked that way or not, right? And so that was an important policing of that boundary. And there are, court cases of people saying, I've been misclassified, and if someone could say, oh no, your grandmother, your great-grandmother, we've got you classified the right way, right? So, I mean, so this is to say that's how it works and has worked in the United States, but it hasn't always worked that way in Latinx countries, right? In Brazil and other places where in South and Central America, where racial categories may have been more fluid. Right. So now, if you are a light-skinned person who speaks Spanish and is from Cuba, you might feel white identified, both in terms of how you look and maybe in terms of your socioeconomic status, and your ethnicity is Cuban, but how you're defining yourself in terms of your racial category in the context of the United States might be one way, and someone with a similar ancestry but who looks different might be defining their race a different way. And then let's add in the mix of multiracial identity, right? This is not in your question, but I think it's relevant, which is to say that now you can choose multiracial, right, as a category. And in the census, there's been a dramatic rise in the percentage of multiracial people in the United States. Is that because there are more multiracial people, or because more people are choosing that identity? It's a combination of both, right? We know that there are more multiracial marriages, more multiracial children, but what's really interesting, I found when I was working on the book, around multiracial identity was, again, how the categories may be shifting. So there, we talked about, more information. There are more research studies being done with people who identify as multiracial, and they don't all describe themselves in the same way. So so some of them will say, and maybe and when people ask me questions like, well, what about multiracial identity? I always say it depends. And it depends on a lot. It may depend on, do you have parents who have told you, here's how we want you to define yourself? You know, it depends on how you look. You know, let's use Barack Obama as an example. He claims a black identity. He always acknowledges his white mother, but he also acknowledges the fact that when I walk down the street, people perceive me as black, and that is the identity I have chosen for myself. And if you've read his book, A Song from My Father, he's very explicit in that memoir about his active seeking out of his black male identity and what that meant to him, and how he was looking for role models to kind of figure out how to be in the world. That same person in that same circumstance might have a very different experience if his physical appearance is different, right? There is one of the things that is very interesting in 2020 is that there are some multiracial folks who are choosing to identify themselves as white, which, you know, in the old one-drop rule would not be possible. Right. But researchers have found that there are some multiracial people who are checking the white box, not in the way of passing, as in they're not disavowing their darker relatives of color, but simply because people perceive them as white, they treat, you know, and that is, it just gets too complicated to always say, no, really I'm not, right? And so there are not very many examples of this in the research, but there's some examples in the research of people who will say, you know, I checked the white box. I choose to check the white box because I look white, people treat me as white, I'm having a white life experience. But, you know, they also carry pictures of their relatives. It's not like they are in the old sense of the, you know, Jim Crow era trying to escape blackness. Right. They're not disavowing family members or trying to pass, as the language was then, but, you know, claiming, and you know, this is the identity that that best describes my lived experience. What researchers find, however, is that the conflicts that people have often occur when the identity that they're claiming for themselves is not validated by their social context. So if I claim a black identity and no one believes it about me, that may be complicating. Or if I claim a white identity and people are challenging that, that may be complicated. But what's perhaps most complicated is if I claim a biracial identity, but people don't recognize me as biracial, right? So I'm thinking now of one of the people cited in the study who was a dark-skinned black woman, and people looked at her and described her. You know, she's a black woman. She thought of herself as a biracial woman, but nobody perceived her biraciality, you know? And so there was not an external validation of the identity that she felt was most authentic to her lived experience. On the other hand, if you are a biracial or multiracial person whose appearance is racially ambiguous, you know, the person whose physical appearance prompts people to ask questions like, what are you? Yes. If that's your lived experience, one, that's irritating, and two, but it's easy for you to claim a biracial identity. If you say to someone who asks that question, I'm biracial, they're like, oh, that explains it, right? You know what I mean? And so there's a match between the biracial identity you're claiming and the perception of the surrounding world. But if that's not the identity you're claiming, but one that's being projected onto you, it's when your internal identity and your external identity as imposed on you are not matching, that's when people are most likely to feel conflict.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I'm going to encourage those who may have a question to begin to make your way. We have mics on either side of the aisle. And while you're doing that, I'll continue to engage Dr. Tatum in a conversation, but please begin to make your way to the aisle if you have a question. You know, in talking about racial classification, it's pretty clear that it's complex.
Yeah, very complex.
Very complex. And one of the things that we know in this work is that we have to be very clear in what we're talking about.
Yes.
And so in our Diversity and Inclusion Action Plan, which I know you had a chance to review, one of the things we did was to first and foremost define what we meant by diversity, historically underrepresented groups. And that's one of the things that I've found always so useful with your text, this one in particular, is that right from the start, I think the first chapter is defining race, defining racism. Because if we're not talking about the same thing, you know, how far can we get in this complex conversation?
Right.
And so can you talk a bit about your definition of racism, particularly prejudice plus power?
Yeah, so actually that is a definition, but not my preferred definition.
Okay.
So the definition that I use in my book, and I know that there are multiple ways that people define these terms, but the definition that I found most useful in my teaching experience was a definition that came from the work of sociologist David Wellman. He wrote a book a long time ago called Portraits of White Racism. And one of the things that he talked about in that book was the fact that there were lots of people who were not actively prejudiced in terms of their expressed attitudes toward people of color, white people he was interviewing, but who defended their advantage, the systematic advantage that came to them as a consequence of their racism, defended differential investment in schools, for example, defended segregated neighborhoods at the same time that they disavowed personal prejudice. And so having come to this set of observations, he developed a definition of racism as a system of advantage based on race. And racists as those who are benefited by that system of advantage without choosing to interrupt it. So so that's the definition that I use. Prejudice plus power is a commonly used one, and it tries to speak to the same thing. But what I found in my teaching experience was my students did not experience themselves as powerful. So they would say, this definition doesn't have anything to do with me. I don't have power. Right? But of course, everybody has some, if we think of power as influence and access to resources, et cetera, I mean, there's ways you can unpack that to help students see their place in that definition, but I really like the system of advantage based on race. Though I also want to say, I see that you have a copy of Ibram Kendi's book up here, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and he has a slightly different definition. I like his too.
Okay.
So just so we know. Yeah.
We'll move to questions.
Dr. Tatum, thank you with us. There we go.
Yeah.
I'm Professor Jonathan Collins. I'm a faculty member in the education department.
Yes.
Twofold question. It's only right in academia, right? Multiple questions. The first question centers around just what do you think are the effects of maybe sort of the intergenerational effects of when you talk about racial avoidance. So they're the kids that you studied who were socialized into racial avoidance. Speculate on what you think are the intergenerational effects of those kids having kids and also sort of furthering this logic.
Yes.
Second question goes back to your experience as the president of Spelman College. What do you think is the sort of the role of HBCUs currently, widely interpreted?
Well, these are two very different questions, but I'm going to link them, right? Okay, and I'm going to link them in the example of a young woman I interviewed who attended a small, elite, Ivy plus kind of college in New England. And at the time that and she was from, no question, from a race avoidant family. And really, and every time she really felt isolated growing up going to mostly white schools, in an urban area, but, her parents were making choices for her that tended to remove her from black communities, and felt very isolated by that. And she then went off to this college, which was kind of a repeat of that. And she actually had wanted to go to Howard University, but her parents had talked her out of that, thinking that she would have a better experience at this, more, this predominantly white, perceived as a more elite institution. And so there she was, and not particularly happy. And I was interviewing her, and she talked about, just this life of always feeling like you were never quite good enough, never smart enough, never pretty enough, never, fill in the blank enough. And then she said, this is getting to your intergenerational question and the HBCU question, which then she said in her interview, I'm going to Howard University for grad school if it kills me, right? It's like, I need to have this experience. And she, and that is, when I was president of Spelman, I used to say to prospective students, why do students want to come to Spelman? They want to be at a place where they're going to be at the center of the educational experience, not on the margins of it in any way. And there are very few places a black student can say, certainly a black female student, there's only one place really, that a black woman can say, this place was built for me. And I'm not going to have to sacrifice anything to be here. And so that's a very important message. Now, having said that, we know that HBCUs are overrepresented in the pipeline they create of students having success in the STEM fields. To use Spelman as a particular example, there are more black women with Ph.D.s in the sciences who came from Spelman than any other institution in the nation. And so that is a direct consequence of the confidence that comes from being at the center of the educational experience. No one is saying you don't belong in this class. This class was designed for you, right? And so so we live in a time when that kind of affirmation is still necessary and important. Not everybody makes that choice. I didn't go to an HBCU. I used to say I had my HBCU experience later in life. But having that option available, I think, is a very important option. And you can spot the students who had that experience often by the confidence they exude.
Thank you.
Spoken as a Morehouse grad, I know. Yes. Go ahead.
Good evening. Thank you so much both for being here. It's been really delightful. Dr. Tatum, I'd like to have your insights. I'd like to hear your insights because your areas of expertise sort of intersect in such an interesting way for me, both education and the development of sense of self.
Yes.
I am a teacher at the most economically disadvantaged city in Rhode Island. It's 1 square mile. It's a place where I graduated high school. And one of the insidious results of charter schools has been that the children that have the greatest needs have been left in the public school. And at least some of these charter schools, I can think of one very clearly, tells the children that attend that school that the children that are left behind are the thugs, the waste of society.
Oh, that's
and
horrible.
so what ends up happening is that these children live next to each other. They're neighbors, they're cousins, they're often friends. And my students, their young minds are poisoned by the idea that they're not as good because they didn't get selected to go to the charter schools that are now hyper-segregated. 90% of my students are brown, they're black or Latino. And I'd like to hear from you, what can I do both in the short term, the kids that I have in front of me, and in the long term?
Well, so I think it's horrible what you just described, and I don't think it's necessary. Without getting into the specifics of, this charter versus that school, or, without getting into that, it is certainly possible to affirm an educational experience without maligning another choice, right? So let's just start with that. So if you were saying to me, how do I work with a group of students who have been labeled with pejorative labels? I would say, let's interrupt that by affirming that identity, and let's start with what I'm going to call the ABCs. So what do I mean by those ABCs? The A is affirming identity. And this relates to your question, but it's, I know there are a number of educators here. Any school should be thinking about how these ABCs apply. The A stands for affirming identity. The B stands for building community. The C stands for cultivating leadership. Okay, so what do I mean by the A? Affirming identity has everything to do with the fact that we all want to see ourselves as part of the environment in ways that are positive. Let's imagine there was a photographer up here on the stage with the two of us, taking a group shot of all of you here, a historic event. You're all here today having this conversation, and you get on the way out the door a copy of this photograph. What is the first thing you're going to do when you get your copy?
Look for yourself.
That is the only answer to that question. You are going to look for yourself, right? No one says, I'm looking for Beverly Tatum, unless you are Beverly Tatum, right? You are looking for yourself in that picture. And if we think about how we move through the world, we're always looking for ourselves in spaces, right? So if I'm a kid coming into that school, I'm looking for myself in that school. Now let me say another word about that picture. You're going to look for yourself in the picture. Not only are you going to look for yourself in the picture, but when you find yourself, you're going to check out how you're looking, right? You want to be in the picture looking good. And if you're in the picture not looking good, you're not showing that picture to other people, right? But let's imagine, and this is possible in the age of, photo technology. Let's imagine that every sixth person, wherever you're sitting, 6 people over, every sixth person is digitally removed from the photo. You get your copy of the photo, you wonder, I was sitting right there, next to the person in the green sweater, but now I'm not in the picture. What happened, right? You would think, what's wrong with this picture? But at the end of the day, let's imagine you come to these events frequently and there's frequent photos, and it just happens that your seat is the one that's digitally removed every time. After a while, you're going to say, not what's wrong with this picture, what's wrong with me, right? How come I'm never included? So the first thing I would say is, do your kids see themselves included in the school? That doesn't just mean, are there other kids who look like me? Am I in the curriculum? Are there educators? What about the pictures around the building? I'm not going to name any names, but I walked into a school once that had a row. It was a private school, but it had a row of portraits of the important people, mostly like heads of school, maybe heads of boards or whatever, but they were all white men. And across the same wall was a carved message, and the carved message said, "Be true to your heritage." Well, what's the message to the kid who doesn't look like that, who's walking in that building every day, right? So even in, I have the privilege of working with a principal in Atlanta as a volunteer. I'm on what is called in Atlanta the GO team, which is like the principal's board. And that principal works hard to make sure, and this is 100% free and reduced lunch school, Title I, low-income kids from probably the poorest neighborhood, one of the poorest neighborhoods in Atlanta. And yet the principal has gone to great lengths to make sure that the school is attractive, right? The physical appearance of the school is attractive because she wants the kids to feel like they deserve an attractive space in which to learn. And that, they need to see themselves as having opportunity. And she works hard. It's a public school, it's not a charter school. She works hard to make sure that the kids have access to resources, whether that's people coming to visit or getting the kids out into the city to experience, beyond just the walls of their apartments or whatever, the limits of the neighborhood that they're in. And anyway, all that's about the A, affirming identity. We all want to feel our identities as mattering and being affirmed and not maligned or denigrated. The B is about building community. And how do we create a sense of community where we care for one another and we are supportive of one another? In this particular school that I'm just describing, one of the strategies is something the principal calls crew, which is to say that we're all part of the crew here. And so at the start of every day, every teacher has the assignment of giving the crew members a chance to check in and talk about, how was your evening, what's going on, some opportunity to share so that they can kind of clear their heads and be ready to learn. And to spend as much time, the principal tells the teachers, with crew as is necessary to be able to then move the kids on in a positive way. And then, but that's, how do we build a sense of community? Now, in a racially mixed community, where some kids are naturally affirmed, where the white kids see themselves in the books and the kids of color don't, part of what we want to try to do is create a sense where everybody feels a part. And it's hard to do the B without the A, right? If we think about a group photo, people don't hang around to do the group photo unless they're confident they're going to be in the picture, right? If you don't think you're going to be in the picture, you're out the door for the parking lot, right? So the B and the A go together, but the C is also important, which is how do we cultivate the leadership of our students? In the context of your school, how do those students come to see themselves as problem solvers, as leaders who can have a positive impact in their community? And that might happen in a racially homogeneous community, but certainly in a diverse community, we want students to have the opportunity to learn how to connect across lines of difference so that they can develop the 21st century skills you need in what is increasingly a pluralistic society, not one group having a majority. Because if you're not able to do that, you really are setting yourself up, or we are setting our students up, to be what I call social dinosaurs. And so that is really critical. I'm not sure I've really answered your question, except to say that I think it is really important to affirm within the school positive messages so that the negativity that others are putting out there, that they're somehow inoculated from that negativity. Easier said than done, but I think that's what our goal should be.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good evening. Thank you very much for enriching us with your experiences here, Dr. Tatum. My name is Musa. I'm on the staff here at the university. As I was walking down here, I was telling myself, I'm not going to ask you if you're related to the star basketball player, Jason Tatum. But I guess I just did. The real question is, that was a very interesting statistic that you cited with regard to the number of black women Ph.D.s in the STEM fields out of Spelman. And really provoked a thought in me, which is, can you envision a future where the HBCU, as it's known today, is no longer relevant?
I can envision a future where there is less need, but not in the immediate future, for sure. If we think about, much could be said in the same about women's colleges, right? So a similar question might be asked, is there a future where women's colleges are not relevant? Now, I, of course, was president of Spelman, which was both a women's college and an HBCU. I spent 13 years at Mount Holyoke College, also a women's college. I did not attend a women's college, right? And in some ways, I did the opposite. I went to Wesleyan in the second year that they were accepting women, so it was mostly a male environment. But having said that, the reality is that as long as we have a society that reinforces messages that suggest groups of people are somehow less capable, less eligible, less given less opportunity, then having environments that provide a counter narrative is important.
Thank you.
That's what I guess I'd leave it at that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello. Thank you for coming. I'm Catherine. I'm just one of those women in STEM, not an educator. But I was hoping you could tell me, based on your research, have you seen any role in gender as it played in racial attitudes?
Can you be more specific with your question?
Sure. I was hoping to find out, when you were doing research
Yeah.
on racial attitudes and racism, especially amongst those that were raised in those raised in predominantly white communities,
Yes.
if you saw a role of gender also
Yes.
playing a part.
Yes, I did. So, so the experiences of young black women in predominantly white communities is different than the experiences of young black men in predominantly white communities. And how so? So particularly in adolescence, one of the things that happens, or at least was true in the case of the students that I was studying, and the feedback I get from, young black women I meet who've grown up in this environment often affirm this, is that the women tend to be more socially isolated. They are sometimes more socially isolated. So what does that mean? It means I'm going to refer to what I call the birthday party effect. When you are in the 1st or 2nd grade and somebody's having a birthday party, everybody in the class gets invited, right? But when you're in the 7th or 8th or 9th grade, it's not like that, right? It's a much smaller group of people who are going to be invited. And in that smaller group of people in that, middle school or high school year, in a predominantly white environment, sometimes the black girls get left out of the girl groups, right? And, maybe it's because there are boy-girl parties and there's anxiety about cross-racial dating. We live in a time when when that is more common, but still you can see that pattern. People are sleeping over. If there are, girls are having these sleepover parties, things like that. And if there are, if they're living in separate communities because of racial segregation, there may be anxiety about, well, she can come to my house, but you can't go to her house, because it's in a, quote, dangerous neighborhood. That might be part of the narrative. There are complexities around social relationships that often leave black girls feeling socially isolated. Now, why is that different for boys? Well, it might be the same for boys. I don't want to suggest that boys don't ever feel socially isolated, but boys, particularly if they're athletically successful, have a natural route into friendship patterns, right? So you're on a team, you're playing on the team, you get included. If you have ever visited a predominantly white high school with cheerleaders, maybe there's one black cheerleader, but not usually more than that, right? And so the same kind of opportunity through the kind of social structures that high schools create sometimes leave girls out.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have time for one more. Oh, two. I see these two. And I think that's it. Thank you.
That tall. Good evening. My name is Janae Davis. Just want to kind of preface by saying I kind of resent that you said that Spelman is the only place for black women in college.
No,
I'm
no,
a Bennett grad. I'm a Bennett grad, proud Bennett grad, so I have to put that out there.
So I'm going to clarify why I said that, but keep going with your question.
I have an idea. Why you said it, but I just want to put it out there. But my question is, in the times that we live in right now, it seems that diversity and inclusion, is particularly in education, is kind of like a hot topic. It's a buzzword right now. Everybody's kind of jumping on that train. And I would imagine while I was a child when your first book came, when the original version of the book came out, I would imagine that it was a hot topic then. So I'm wondering, with the way that things go, in the sense that the oppressed are kind of the ones that take on the brunt of making people understand that they are participating in the oppression, how do we kind of sustain the momentum in increasing diversity, inclusion, and equity in our institutions, and kind of keep it from becoming just something to talk about or to do that was a trend in 2020?
Well, I think in some ways your question brings us back to the beginning, which was, that quote from Dr. King's book. We were talking about his observation that the line of progress is never straight, right? So you have these periods of pushing forward, and then there's periods of pushing back, and then you have to push forward again. But certainly at the institutional level, I can't underscore, I really want to underscore how important leadership is. Leadership matters. And so, you can have a conversation and check the box, we had a conversation, and then move on, and not much happens. Or you can say this is a priority and you can really push for it and make it part of budgeting and part of evaluation and part of, a real effort to change how things are done. That's, it's not an easy process to do that, but it does require a sustained effort. And places that are making that sustained effort are seeing progress. But part of the challenge, and I can say this as someone who's been, at 2 different institutions. I spent 13 years at Mount Holyoke, and I was 13 years as president of Spelman. Things that you think you have made an effort to change, when the leadership changes, sometimes some of that stuff unravels, right? So I experienced that when I was at Mount Holyoke. There were some things that I served as dean for 4 years and that we put in place as dean that are not in place today. And some things that were in place when I was dean that went away and now they're putting back, right? That there's this sort of ebb and flow. And that's one of the reasons why institutions that have a history of long-serving leaders often are able to make more progress than institutions that have had rapid churn, because you need that kind of leadership.
Just a quick follow-up, is the class at UC Santa Barbara that you taught, is that still offered?
It actually is, yes.
Hi, it's nice to meet you. So I'm a student at St. Andrew's School in Barrington, and my classmates and I were tasked with writing a paper about something that we were interested in or we cared about. And there was one paper that was written about whether we believed that discrimination and racism would ever come to an end, and I just was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Well, I'm curious to know what you concluded.
I said no, but
Yeah. It's hard to, if we look at the history, I can see why you said no, right? And one of the things that I hesitate to say no, though I think there's very little evidence to suggest otherwise, right? But because I am a hopeful person by nature and profession, I am reluctant to say no. And I thought it was interesting. I was sitting in my seat looking at the Brown motto, and which is "In God We Hope," I'm told, right? My Latin's not that great, but in God We Hope. And it made me think about a quote from, I'm blanking on his name, but you're gonna all know who I'm talking about. The guy who wrote Just Mercy, Brian Stevenson.
Brian Stevenson, yeah.
Yeah. So I told you knew. So Brian Stevenson says that, it's necessary to be hopeful, right? That injustice prevails when injustice persists when hopelessness prevails. I want to repeat that. Injustice persists when hopelessness prevails, because you have to feel hopeful in order to work against injustice. So, while the odds, I think, are stacked against the complete elimination of discrimination and racism, and human nature being what it is, there's a challenge there. At the same time, I think we can continue to evolve toward a better society. And we have to be hopeful in order to do that.
thank you.
Thank you.
thank you for spending your evening with us. I think these conversations are important and should continue, and we should use empathy and hope. And I look forward to engaging with you all in the next years to come. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Tatum.
Thank you for being here.